Now, in its current state, our styles.css is looking a little bit atrocious. I mean, there's so much repetition here. Montserrat bold font family, Montserrat bold font family. And you might even remember how many times we wrote padding 7%, 15%, right? We wrote it like all over the place, here and many, many more. So, as I said previously, as a programmer, we're always aspiring to be dry. Do not repeat yourself. And the opposite of this is kind of our code at the moment, and it's probably like wet code. We enjoy typing. This is why we want to refactor our code on a regular basis in order to keep it performant and easy to read. Now, whenever I go on holiday, I always seem to be packing an hour before I have to leave. I think I have some medical condition where I can't pack in advance. So my suitcase always inevitably ends up looking like this, basically a mess, and I have to sort of like kneel on it to try and close it, and everything is everywhere, and it's just impossible to find anything once I actually do arrive. Now, instead, what would be a lot nicer is if I had actually learnt the skills of packing properly so that everything is neat and tidy, and myself or anybody else would be able to easily find anything they need inside this suitcase. And this is kind of the idea behind code refactoring as well, right? I mean, incidentally, I'm also the type of person who cooks and makes a huge mess in the kitchen, and then I will just sort of mentally ignore it until I eat. And then after I eat, I kind of have to confront the situation, or sometimes, maybe even go 2 meals without tidying the kitchen. But of course, the longer that you go on like this, the harder it is to continue cooking because you can't find anything and everything is everywhere. So one of the most memorable things that I remember from one of my mentors is that he once said, you should refactor your code and maintain it to keep your code in a state as if you expect the next person who's going to have to maintain your code to be an axe murderer. Basically, how much do you want to get murdered when they can't find any of the variables and they can't figure out why something's going wrong because your code is a mess and it's a load of unorganized spaghetti code? So we've spoken enough about why we need to refactor our code, but how do you actually do it? Well, there's a number of guiding principles that most people will follow when they're refactoring their code. And for me, the order of importance goes more or less like this. So I would prioritize readability as the number one priority. So make sure that your code is easy to understand for not just, yourself, but maybe say your future self. Say when you come back in a year to try and understand your code, can you quickly understand what's going on? Is everything organized in a logical way? Is everything commented so that you can easily understand what each part of the code is about? And also when somebody else comes along, or if you're working on the same project with another person, and this is a very common scenario if you're working in any sort of company or team, you're likely to be cooperating on the same piece of code. So remember, axe murderer, bad. So try to keep your code readable. Now, the next thing is modularity. And this kind of relates to how easy is it to reuse bits of your code and how easy is it to narrow down. Say if, one particular part of your website breaks down, is your code modular enough that you would be able to narrow down on the exact section of code or code file that's responsible for the problems that's occurring? Now, at the moment, because we're only covering basically HTML and CSS, we haven't really dug into this idea of modularity. Although I've tried to impress upon you the importance of keeping your structure code inside the HTML and your style code inside the CSS, so that when you come to debugging your code, you know where to look. And this kind of division of labor is another form of modularity. But as we go on to learn more about JavaScript or Node.js backend stuff, we're going to be making our code more and more modular so that it's easier to maintain as it gets more complex and more interesting. And then we come on to the slightly less important things like efficiency. How fast does your code run? There's ways of making your code very efficient and very fast. Now, a lot of that happens at the choosing the programming language level. So, you want something fast, choose something like C, right? Something that's close to the metal. But there's also other ways of improving the efficiency of your code. But it's much, much less important than keeping your code modular and readable. So that's why it's number 3. And the last thing that a lot of people like to obsess about, but it's mostly a vanity thing, is the length of your code. You will very often hear coding bros talk about how short they've managed to make their code. And very often when you're talking to a bunch of programmers and somebody says that I built this feature and, it only has, 21 lines, then somebody else is going to come along inevitably and going to be like, well, I can write that in Haskell and it'll be 10. And, yours truly, I might have also engaged in such terrible behavior, but it's kind of more like recreational. This is not good coding practice by any means. Now, if you're cutting down on the length to improve readability, then that's great. That's really, really important. Making sure that you're not repeating yourself in your code so that you keep your code really well structured and readable. That is very important, up there, number 1. But if you're purely just reducing the length of your code and actually making your code less readable, less comprehensible, then that's bad. And if you're building code for enterprise or for your company, then that's probably not what you want to do. But if you are doing it just for fun, there's actually a sport amongst programmers called code golf. Don't worry, it doesn't involve, getting changed or actually having to sweat. All it involves is trying to figure out how you can write the shortest code possible in order to achieve a certain task. And if you're interested, there's a section of Stack Exchange called codegolf.stackexchange where they've got a whole bunch of these kind of things. For example, this one is where you get to create a magic 8-ball that spits out one of these answers randomly, and you have to do that in the least number of characters of code possible. So you see stuff like people using crazy programming languages which are just like, look how short this is. And for some reason, it's able to spit out that code. But more likely, you're going to see something like this or something like this. But it's a fun place to explore once you've really understood a particular language and you really want to flex your code biceps for recreation. But for code that you're going to ship, this is not important at all. So I just want to make that really clear. Now, let's head into our code and see what we can do to refactor it and make it more readable and more modular.